Hello, my name's Nick Florence and I'm going to talk about the speaking section of the IELTS test. In my talk I'm going to tell you about the test format, going to show you some example questions and tell you some strategies that you can use to prepare for the test and strategies that you can use in the test. After that I'll show you where you can get some further help. We'll start by looking at the overall test format. So the overall format is the test lasts between 11 and 14 minutes. It's a one-to-one interview, which means there's one examiner and one candidate. And the interview is recorded, which means the examiner will turn on the tape recorder. The test has three parts. Part 1, which usually lasts between 4 and 5 minutes, is the examiner asking you questions about your life, your interests, your hometown. Part 2, which is about 3 to 4 minutes, is you giving a short talk on a topic that the examiner selects for you. And Part 3 is a discussion on issues related to that topic. So the examiner will ask you some more questions about the same kind of topic that you talked about in Part 2. So now we'll look at Part 1 of the test. First of all, the test format. This section will last about 4 to 5 minutes. What will happen first is the examiner will introduce himself or herself to you, check your ID, and then ask you some questions about yourself. These questions can be about your hometown, your home area, can be about your family, about your job, your studies, your interests. The examiner has these questions written down, so he's never improvising. He's not really reacting to what you say, but he has a range of questions that he can choose from. Here are some typical questions for this stage of the test. For example, where do you live? Describe your hometown to me. Tell me about your family members. What are you studying? What do you dislike most about your studies? Do you like eating in restaurants, and why? What type of transport do you use most, and why? I'll tell you some strategies that you can use. Strategies to prepare for this section of the test, and strategies to use in the test. First of all, preparation. Well, think about questions that people ask when they want to get to know someone. What questions do you think people might ask you in order to get to know you? What questions would you ask other people in order to get to know them? When you've thought of some questions, check how you would answer them. Okay? Think about the vocabulary you need. Have you got all the words you need to answer the question? If you don't have all the words you need to check somewhere, get some more vocabulary. So practice answering that kind of question. You can also think carefully about tenses. For example, talking about me, I can say, I live on Cheung Chau. I have lived there for 14 years. I moved there in 1989. In this short answer, I've used 3 different tenses. I live there, present tense. I've lived there for 14 years, present perfect tense. I moved there in 1989, past simple tense. So just talking about where I live, I use 3 different tenses in a very short answer. So think about the tenses that you need to use to answer these type of questions. And then some strategies while you're in the test. I think there's only one main strategy, and that is to relax. Pretend you're talking to a new friend. The examiners are all practiced at talking to candidates, so they will try to make you feel relaxed. So that's the best thing you can do. Relax, imagine you're talking to a new friend, try to be interested in telling this new friend about yourself. Now we'll move on to part 2 of the test. The test format for part 2 is that the examiner will ask you to talk for 1 or 2 minutes about a topic that he selects. The topics, with some prompt questions to help you answer it, are written on a card, and the examiner will give you this card. The examiner will give you 1 minute to prepare the talk, and he'll give you a piece of paper and a pencil so that you can make notes. So in this 1 minute, it's a good idea to make notes while you're preparing. The examiner will then tell you when 1 minute is up and will ask you to start talking. The examiner will tell you that while you're talking, he will not interrupt, but if it's longer than 2 minutes, he will stop you. After your talk is finished, the examiner may ask 1 or 2 follow-up questions. Okay, so here's an example of a part 2 question. What will be written on the card is something like, describe a teacher who has greatly influenced you in your education. You should say when you met them, what subject they taught, what was special about them, and explain why this person influenced you so much. The examiner will hand you a card with all this written on it, and the examiner will say something like, I'd like you to describe a teacher who has greatly influenced you. Okay, and now some strategies to help you prepare for part 2 and strategies you can use in the test while you're doing it. So for preparation, of course, you can practice talking about topics for 1 or 2 minutes. And there are some books where you can find topics. I'll tell you about the books later. So find a topic, practice talking about it for 1 or 2 minutes. While you're doing this, you can record yourself. Since this is a one-person talk, you can record yourself and then listen back to it. When you're listening back, you can check how clear it is, how good your pronunciation is. You can check how long you spoke for. You can check what vocabulary you used if you needed more vocabulary. So I think for this one, tape recording yourself is a very, very good idea. You can also practice making the notes. You get 1 minute for making the notes, and this is not very long. 1 minute comes up very quickly. So you can practice making notes on the topic in 1 minute. You can practice some abbreviations that you might use. You can practice a way to make notes quickly that's helpful for you. Okay, and then in the test, well, of course, you must say something that's true. If you choose an example that's not really true, you won't be able to talk about it. When you're speaking in the test, I suggest that you refer to your notes. This means that you don't have to keep too much information in your head at one time. You've made the notes, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with looking at them. Timing is quite important. If you talk for less than 1 minute, the examiner may think you haven't developed your topic very well. So, although you can't time yourself in the exam, you want to make sure it's long enough. There's no problem with talking for too long. Again, another suggestion is try to relax and enjoy telling the interviewer about the topic. All the topics are chosen to be things that people can talk about quite easily. They're chosen so that you can select something that's interesting for you to talk about. The more you sound interested, the more interesting it will be for the examiner. And now we move on to part 3. So the format of part 3 is that the examiner will ask you some questions related to the topic of part 2. And you'll be expected to give some opinions and to give an answer in some depth. Here's an example. So following on from part 2, which was about a teacher that influenced you, part 3 would be a discussion or questions on the topic of education. Here are some example questions. How has education changed in your country in the last 10 years? What changes do you foresee in the next 50 years? How do the expectations of today's school leavers compare with those of the previous generation? What role do you think extracurricular activities play in education? Okay. And now some strategies that you can use to prepare for part 3 and strategies you can use in the test. Well, for preparation, you need to think about the language to use. You need to be able to describe things, compare things, and speculate on what might happen in the future. Okay, for example, question 1 was, how has education changed in your country in the last 10 years? So you need to be able to describe this, and you need to be able to use tenses, the right tenses to show changes in the last 10 years. Past tense, present perfect tense, these may all be used in this section. Language of comparison. For example, how do the expectations of today's school leavers compare with those of the previous generation? So you need to be able to compare the expectations of 2 generations. So language of comparison, make sure you know it. Another question then would be, what changes do you foresee in the next 50 years? So you need to think about speculation language. I think this might happen. This will probably happen. Make sure that you can use this kind of language. The questions will not always be about Hong Kong, but you can always use Hong Kong as an example. So you can practice talking about changes in Hong Kong, comparing the past in Hong Kong to the present, think about possible changes in the future. It's a good idea to read newspapers and be aware of issues and things that are happening in Hong Kong at the moment. Okay. And then in the test, what strategies can you use? Well, this is probably the most difficult part of the test, and it's meant to test the candidates, to test their language to a greater extent than the others. You don't get to look at the questions in this case, so you have to listen carefully and make sure you understand the question. A good strategy is to rephrase or reformulate the question in your own words. You can do this in your head, but if you do it aloud, then the examiner has something to listen to. It gives you some thinking time before you answer. So, for example, if the question is, how has education changed in your country in the last 10 years? You could say, I see. The changes in education in Hong Kong in the last 10 years. Okay, well, this gives you some time to think about your answer. Now, although you're supposed to give an in-depth answer, this section is not a 1 or 2 minute talk like section 2. So it doesn't matter if your answers are short. You don't have to say everything about the topic, but try to give some depth to your answer, give some opinions. When you give an opinion, explain what it means, justify it, show why you think it's true. All this will help to make your answer interesting. Another thing to think about is how to finish your answer. It's a good idea to finish clearly so the examiner knows you've finished and knows you're ready for the next question. You can indicate this by your tone of voice, with your voice going down at the end of your answer. You can indicate with a hand gesture. You can indicate with a short phrase like, that's all. Another possibility is to return to the question. So looking at the question, how has education changed in your country in the last 10 years? You could finish it by going back to the question and saying something like, so I think that's all the changes in education in the last 10 years. Something like that, going back to the question. That's all I have to say about the changes in education. So that it makes a clear, complete answer and a clear end to your answer. And I think that's all I have to say about strategies for part 3. Now we'll look at the assessment criteria. How is the speaking component assessed? Well, the aim of the test is to assess your ability to communicate effectively. The examiner will be considering this basically in 4 areas. The first area is fluency and coherence, where fluency means, are you able to speak at length? Are you able to give long answers? Are you able to speak without hesitation? Of course, we all hesitate when we're speaking. There are natural pauses when you're looking for ideas, but the examiner will also think about, are you pausing for a long time to search for your words? Coherence is the ability to express your ideas. Are you able to communicate your ideas clearly? Are you able to start a point and finish a point clearly without repeating too much, without contradicting yourself? The second area is lexical resource. Lexical resource means vocabulary. Do you have the vocabulary you need to express your ideas? Or are you using a very limited range of vocabulary? Do you have any idiomatic phrases? It's a good idea to use idiomatic phrases if you know some. But the examiner is also considering, is the vocabulary you use accurate? So if you do use idiomatic phrases, make sure you're using them accurately. The third area is grammatical range and grammatical accuracy. Grammatical range means, are you able to use a variety of different kinds of grammatical structures? Are you able to use complex sentences as well as simple ones? Are they accurate? Are your simple sentences accurate, and are your complex sentences accurate? If you make some mistakes, are you able to correct yourself and rephrase it? The fourth area is pronunciation. Basically, it's just about being clear. Are the words, your pronunciation of individual words, is it clear? And then, does it sound natural? Are you using stress and rhythm in a natural way? Do you have a very strong accent, or does your accent resemble native English speaking? But basically, is it easy to understand what you're saying? So finally, some places where you can get further help. My main recommendation, of course, is CIL, the Centre for Independent Language Learning. In CIL, there are several books about IELTS. I'm going to recommend 2 to you now. First of all, if you have a long time to prepare, then this book, which is called Insight into IELTS, is very useful. It's got lots of tips and strategies for the exam, lots of exercises you can do to practice, and things that will help you to prepare. However, if you only have a short time, then I think I would recommend Cambridge IELTS book. This is basically questions, exam questions, sample questions that you can practice. But just note that you need to do number 3, because the format has changed, so books 1 and 2 don't have the correct format. Also in CIL, there's usually a teacher at the help desk. You can speak to this teacher. You can even ask the teacher if you can practice answering some questions for IELTS. And then there's SAP, the Speaking Assistance Program. Here you make a small group of students and you speak to the teacher for 1 hour, and with the teacher there you can practice answering IELTS questions. Finally, some websites. The first 2 are websites that have information about the test, when you can take it, how you can take it. And then the CIL website has some practice activities and tips again. And the last one is an online course which has activities, practice, tips, and this is from an Australian university. So I think that's all I've got to say to help you prepare for the IELTS speaking test. Finally, good luck with the test.